We are very happy and honored to have Doug share with us tonight.
Well, first, I'd like to begin by honoring the Kleins. As I understand it, especially after listening to them, they're out on the field playing the football in the Super Bowl, and I'm John Madden. I'm going to come up afterwards and draw things on the board, explain what just happened, or think that I explained just what just happened. One of the things I've found in this whole mess, as this mess is watching it in our country, is like watching a helicopter try to land sideways. It's just bad. And a lot of Christians know what the right thing is. They know what the right thing to do is. But when they're challenged, they don't know how to articulate why or what do you say when they come back at you and say, well, what about this and what about that? So I want to talk about what all this isn't. I want to begin by talking about what it isn't from the Scripture, and then move on and talk about what it is, what's actually going on. In 1 Corinthians 5, I want to begin by answering the first objection. You guys are just full of hate, and you're homophobic. You're somehow afraid of homosexuals, and you don't want to have anything to do with them, and you want to operate in your own economy. You're not willing to participate in the same public economy with sinners or people who don't think like you. You want to go live in your little evangelical ghetto. Well, that's not the issue at all. In 1 Corinthians 5 and then again in 1 Corinthians 10, it says this. Paul says in 5:9, I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world. In other words, Paul says explicitly, I'm not telling you to stay away from sexually immoral people. That's not the issue. He's talking about how you need to discipline within the church. If someone calls himself a brother and is living immorally, then you need to disassociate from them. But that's an act of discipline. It's not an act of that's motivated by thinking that they've got cooties or something. It's not a phobia. So Paul says, no. I'm expecting you as Christians to go out into the world and to rub shoulders with and get along with and talk and chat on the subway with and hand money across the cash register, across the counter with a cash register on it, with people who are all kinds of sinners. He said if the biblical requirement were to avoid that, you'd have to go straight to heaven. You'd have to go right out of the world. So Paul says that explicitly. He says, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous or extortioners or with idolaters, for then you'd have to leave the planet. And then something similar in 1 Corinthians 10, he says, whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that's the pagan meat market, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. If any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, be ye disposed to go. Whatsoever set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake. But if any man say unto you, this was offered and sacrificed to idols, eat not for the sake that showed it, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? So what Paul is saying here, now let me just do a little scenario. Suppose you went into a McDonald's or a Burger King, I'm just using this just an illustration, and you ordered your burger, you ordered your meal, and then you noticed something you'd never noticed before. There was a little alcove in the back with a little statue of a goddess in the alcove, and the burgers came off the grill, and the guy with the paper hat went back and offered the burgers up to the little idol, said a little prayer, and then came out and shoved you. Now, and you're looking in the paper, but did you just really? Now, would there be a controversy in the Christian church over whether it was lawful to eat that hamburger? Yeah, there'd be an uproar. But Paul says, well, the meat's not demon-possessed. There's nothing wrong with the meat. There's nothing wrong with the food. And he says, and that was the way it was in Corinth. If you wanted the really good pot roast, you had to go down to the meat market. And if you went down to the meat market, no telling where that meat was the half a day before. The best cuts, the best meat, would be offered up in this idolatrous system. Now, what this Paul says, you want to make very sure that you don't stumble a brother. So, for example, if there's a guy with you or someone in your church who used to be involved in that idolatry, and he sees you, a stronger Christian, eating this meat, he thinks, oh, it must be okay to do, and then he gets sucked back into it. He said, don't do it for that guy's sake. But he said, there's no problem with the meat. There's no problem with participation there's no problem with full participation in the economy of Corinth. All right? The money doesn't have germs on it. The money doesn't have, well, money has germs on it, but but it's got everybody's germs on it, even your germs. So there's nothing morally contaminating about participating in an economy with people who sin. There's nothing morally contaminating for you if you engage in commerce with people who don't believe in Jesus and who live like they don't believe in Jesus, who are sexually immoral or embezzlers. And so there's no moral problem with participating in that kind of economy. Many years ago, this was even before the internet. In the old days, I don't know how these rumors circulated before the internet, but there was a rumor that was going around in evangelical circles, must have been 30 years ago, that Procter & Gamble was dedicated to Satan. All right, okay, we got some old timers here. Oh yeah. and one time Nancy got a panicked phone call from someone. Procter & Gamble, have you seen the logo? That little spooky, creepy moon face guy and the stars, and it's a satanic symbol, and some executive from Procter & Gamble has said on television that some of their proceeds are all going to Satan, and what do? Satan's gone into soap manufacturing. Nancy talked to me about it, and I said, well, that sounds like a major upgrade. If the devil's going into manufacturing soap, let's encourage that. But the reason I was saying that is there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing business with sinners. Nothing wrong with doing business with sinners. And so consequently, that's not the issue. In all of these controversies, it is not participation in the same economy. So if I owned a hardware store and a homosexual couple came in and wanted to buy a hammer, can I sell them a hammer? Yeah, I can sell them a hammer. I try to sell them 2 hammers. I'm a good capitalist. I'm willing to sell lumber. I'm willing to sell cars. I'm making a birthday cake. If it's lawful to have everybody's birthday is great. Let's celebrate the birthday, because this is us participating in the same society under the lordship of God, under the sovereign care of a sovereign God. We're treating one another with respect. We're all made in the image of God. People who aren't Christians are made in the image of God, and we must treat them with dignity and respect. All right, so that's the first thing. This is not a matter of us wanting to withdraw into our own private ghetto. Here's another thing it is not. This is not the resurrection of Jim Crow laws. One of the first things that comes up in these discussions is that, oh, you're in favor of discrimination, and you must think it was all right. What used to happen in Jim Crow laws were the laws that required discrimination against blacks in the states of the former Confederacy or in border states. I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, and I remember that I went to the white elementary school, and there was a black elementary school a block away from our house, and the white elementary school that I went to was a couple miles from our house. I grew up in a segregated school system. The desegregation order came down when I was a little boy, and there was a lot of tumult and uproar about that. And so people say, well, if you're going to defend this discrimination, then you're defending that discrimination. Right, that's the argument. It's a facile argument. Not only is it a facile argument, not only does it miss, it's exactly backwards. Right? It's exactly backwards. What's happening now is a rerun of Jim Crow. and here's why. When you don't have, notice that I said Jim Crow laws, right? Who's the culprit with Jim Crow laws? Lawmakers, right? Jim Crow laws are the dirty deeds of legislatures. Legislatures pass laws. So, for example, in the state of Alabama, it was against the law for a restaurant owner to serve whites and blacks together in the same restaurant unless there was a partition at least 7 or 8 feet high between the two sections, and unless there were separate entrances and exits for the different races to come in. So you could cook the food in the same kitchen, but you were required by law to separate the sexes, separate the races in your restaurant. Now notice what's happening. That kind of bigotry is, I would say, speaking as a Christian minister, that kind of bigotry is a sin, right? It's a sin. And the government is telling me that if I'm a Christian who understands what God's intention for the races of men to be, that Pentecost is the great reversal of Babel, right? If I understand that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, black or white, if I understand that, and I'm an evangelical, Bible-believing Christian, and I want to open a restaurant in Alabama that serves all races, right? Come on in, and I want to do that. Why can't I do it? Because it's against the law. So the law comes in and says, we are going to require you to sin against your conscience. Does that sound familiar? That's just what's happening here, right? What's happening is the law is saying your biblical conscience has to take the back seat to whatever jag we're currently on. So as soon as you say that, part of the problem is that if you set up, there's one legal theorist who said you should devise your ideal society without knowing where you're going to be born into it. You should devise your ideal sentence without knowing how the direct objects and the subjects are going to be filled in. Shop owner X should be required to serve so-and-so and draw a blank. And you don't know if it's race mixing or segregationist or concerned about participation in same-sex, I call them same-sex mirages. It's not same-sex marriage, it's same-sex mirage. There's no such thing as a same-sex marriage. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a four-sided triangle. Those don't exist either. Now, the government can't mandate four-sided triangles, but they can fine you for saying that there's no such thing as a four-sided triangle. They can do that. So this is not a case of us wanting to opt out of an economy with sinners in it. This is not a case of us trying to resurrect discrimination, the old-style discrimination. Back in the old days, if there had been no Jim Crow laws, and you just had random bigotries here and there, and hostility between the races, if there were no laws, over time, those bigotries would have been broken down because everybody's money is green. Okay? Everybody's money is green. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have a cosmopolitan, people are going to be rubbing shoulders and doing business with each other and overcoming the prejudices they may have grown up with. When you introduce the state operates with a heavy hand, and the state comes in and just doesn't make fine distinctions at all. So we're not defending Jim Crow. What we're doing is we're fighting the resurrection of Jim Crow. That's what this is. That Jim Crow was tyranny against people who didn't want to sin, and this, what we're dealing with today, is tyranny against people who don't want to sin. All right, it's that simple. All right, so what is it? What is actually going on here? I think I hope it struck you that the vanguard in the culture war that is active, it's a devolving into a hot shooting war. It's really, we're headed toward the break point very soon. But I hope it's not been missed by you that the vanguard, the shock troops in this culture war are evangelical florists, bakers, photographers, videographers. Why is that? Why is that? What's going on? Why aren't they going after lumberyards that don't serve homosexuals? Why are they going after florists? Why are they going after these particular professions? And the answer is, these particular professions, and Melissa alluded to this earlier, these professions are glorifying professions. They are professions that make something look good. Okay, that's what they're about. The photographer comes to you and says, we're having this event, we want you to be there, we want you to capture it, we want you to frame it right, we want you to make it look like a joyful occasion because it's supposed to be a joyful occasion. We want you to make it look like a happy occasion because that's what it's supposed to be. We want you to frame it rightly, we want you to capture the moment. And if someone just says, okay, sure, what's your name and phone number, and then they show up 2 minutes before the wedding to take the pictures, their craft competence is low. All right, talking with the folks for an hour or two about the wedding, so you can get your mind around what kind of event it ought to be. That is a great representation of what it means to glorify. Okay, so a photographer glorifies, a florist glorifies, a videographer glorifies, a baker glorifies. And that's not the case when you're dealing with selling somebody a hammer. I'm glorifying nothing. I'm selling them a hammer. What people need to do is recognize, if we have established that we're not trying to get out of the same economy with people who have this particular problem with sin, if we're not trying to get out of the same economy with them, what is going on? Well, what they are demanding is not our participation in the same economy with them. What they're demanding is our approval. That's what they're demanding. They are not saying that it's enough for you to not be manning the barricades and starting a revolution. No, we insist that you approve. Now, here's the problem. Anybody who has spent any time ministering, as I have, to people with same-sex temptations and ministering to people who are homosexual or Christians who struggle with that temptation, one of the most glaringly obvious things about it is that these are sad people. All right? These are sad people. These are miserable people. These are lost people. It's father hunger run amok. These people are sad people. And they're trapped in a sad sin, in a sad circumstance, and they've brought in the federal government to say, no one may say that this is a sad business. All right? Everybody has to act like it's a happy business. Everybody has to act like this is a glorious thing. It's a wedding. And God is all about weddings. You know, the book of Genesis begins with a wedding. The book of Revelation ends with a glorious wedding. This book is a wedding book. All right? Every Sabbath, every Saturday night, our family clan, I've got 3 kids, and we've got 16 grandkids, number 17 on the way. Number 16 is Shadrach, referring earlier. I got a great idea from you. We're going to start calling him Radshak. Okay. Number 16 is Shadrach, and we get together and I ask them catechism questions before we have our Sabbath dinner. And there are a bunch of questions, and the oldest kid in each family asks the catechism questions. But then I ask all the kids, what's the point of the whole Bible? What's the point of the whole Bible? And they all yell together, kill the dragon, get the girl. And that's what this is. It's all about kill the dragon, get the girl. Our first parents sinned. They fell into sin. The dragon tempted them. God promised the woman right away that the seed of the woman was going to crush the head of the seed of the serpent. It's all about kill the dragon. And at the end of the book of Revelation, the bride comes down out of heaven, adorned as a bride for her husband. I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb, and the angel takes John to a high mountain and shows him the new Jerusalem, adorned as a bride for her husband. Now, this book is all about the glory of God. Mankind is the image and glory of God, as it says in 1 Corinthians 11, and it says that woman is the glory of man. Okay? Woman is the glory of man. It says in Proverbs that a woman, a virtuous woman, is the crown for her husband. A virtuous woman is a crown for her husband. It says in 1 Corinthians, she's the glory of her husband. Now, when you have two dudes come in that want to get married, what do you have? Two crownless heads. Right? Two heads, no crown. When you have two women come in together, what do you have? Two crowns and no head. You've got a monstrosity. And what you've done is you bring this monstrosity in and you say to the evangelical professional, here, make this look good. Right? It's like taking your chimp to the beautician. Try some more lipstick. What setting should I use on these clippers? I don't care. You can't do this because this particular sin is a lame sin. It's Paul says in Romans 1 that because they refuse to honor God as God, they refuse to give him thanks, therefore God has given them over. He's given them up. And they run headlong into this particular sin. And then, in the grip of this sin, they're saying, we are insisting that all the evangelicals who belong to the glorifying professions come and glorify this. Well, there's no other way to say this but to say that they are insisting that we applaud it. They're insisting that we approve of it. If they insisted that I merely do business with a homosexual, I'd say, okay, I already was. I'm happy to do that. I don't go around checking the morality of all the cashiers at Winco. Well, I don't because I don't go to Winco, but Nancy doesn't check the background. We don't do background morality checks on the clerks in the stores that we visit. We don't care. It doesn't matter to us. That's not the issue. But if they say, no, you have to approve, at that point we say, well, I can do business with you, but I may not approve. I may not applaud. At the end of Romans 1, which is written by the Apostle Paul, that's at least my view, that it was written by the... Actually, it's an unwarranted jab at Stuart because I also believe the book of Hebrews was written by Paul. But at the end of Romans 1, which the whole chapter is about, the whole chapter is about this rejection of God and how God gives them up and they descend into this sort of sin, such that even the women turn away from the natural use of the man and the men turn away from the women and so forth. At the end, it says, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do them, but have pleasure in them that do them. There are two problems here. One is participation in these sins, and the other is approval of them. Right? There are two problems there. And so as a faithful Christian, I must not participate in these sins, and I must not applaud these sins. I must not give myself to the approval of them. Do we really want to... Now, someone's going to say, there's one other important distinction here, and this is going to touch back on the Jim Crow issues again. Well, what does it mean to live in a free country? Before going on, let me just give a couple of book plugs. I want to be careful on the first one because it's 500 pages and costs $50 or so. But it's by a legal scholar, published by University of Chicago Press, not published out of the right-wing fever swamps. And he's a law professor at Columbia Law School. And he wrote a book, Philip Hamburger is his name, and he wrote a book called Is Administrative Law Unlawful? Is Administrative Law Unlawful? I'll summarize the 500 pages for you. Yes. He shows in meticulous detail how the current regime that we're living under is a regime that the Constitution of the United States was explicitly written to prevent. Okay? It's not just that our activity now is unconstitutional. Our activity now is anti-constitutional and is a form of law, and he traces it back to the royal prerogative of the kings in Great Britain. The kings wanted the royal prerogative. They wanted to run things through administrative law. They wanted courts that didn't have the rules of evidence that our courts do. They didn't want trial by jury. They wanted a star chamber. They wanted that kind of activity. And our founders wrote a constitution that was explicitly designed to exclude that kind of government, which is the kind of government that the Kleins are fighting right now. All right, so that book is well worth your time, particularly if you're involved in this battle in any kind of leadership capacity. This is something you need to be up to speed on it. Is administrative law unlawful? And the answer is yes, administrative law is unlawful. Another book that just came out a few days ago, I haven't had time to finish it, it's by Charles Murray, called By the People. And the subtitle is really promising, and I would encourage you to think this way in the future. The subtitle is Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. Okay? Rebuilding liberty without permission. Your rights are what? God-given. All right, we believe that we have inalienable rights. We are endowed by our Creator, not by the federal government, not by the state government. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That word inalienable means that they cannot be taken away from you. You cannot be detached from them, except by being convicted of a felony or that sort of thing. You cannot have someone come in and just take these rights away from you because they're God-given. You were not endowed with any rights by the evolutionary process. The evolutionary process doesn't know your name. The evolutionary process didn't send a son to die for you. The evolutionary process doesn't give a rip what happens to you. The evolutionary process gave you no rights whatever. We have rights, and the purpose of government is to safeguard those rights. It is not the purpose of government to bestow them. The government does not bestow rights. The government is there to protect you in your exercise of them, and they are to be a wall of defense. They are not to become the thing that you need protection from. All right, so the government, the civil magistrate, should be a shield and a guard for you. It ought not to be the thing you need to be shielded from. So rebuilding liberty without permission. When we get to the point where Christians seriously think through these issues and start studying the Scriptures and start studying our situation, they become like the men of Issachar in the book of Chronicles, who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. We want to be men of Issachar. We want to understand the times, and we want to understand the Word of God, and we want to understand what God calls us to do. But when you are about to exercise your rights, you don't have to take your hat in your hand and go to the tyrant and ask him if it's okay with him if you can be free now. Because what will the tyrant say? No. And let me refer you to this agency over here. And let me refer you to this over here, and you have to get this permit over there, and you have to apply for this, and there are all these regulations, and it's a Byzantine mess. So, next, the next important distinction that I want to make is that it's clear that we are being pressed into this battle because we are refusing to applaud something we must not applaud. We're refusing to approve of something we must not approve of. We are refusing to give our blessing to something that cannot be blessed. That's what it boils down to. Now, someone is going to say, a secularist is going to come back and say, well, that's according to your religion, right? That's according to your religion. And you say, well, yes, but it's okay because my religion is the true one. Well, how do you know that? Well, Jesus rose from the dead. So basically, you're just in an opportunity to preach the gospel. Jesus rose from the dead. But in a society that is diverse as ours, Christians are not interested in becoming petty tyrants themselves. Right? I have no interest in requiring Jewish delis to make me a ham sandwich. Why should I insist? Why should I go into a Jewish deli and insist that they make me a ham sandwich because I want a ham sandwich? And then if they refuse to, because we don't have any ham on the premises, because we're kosher deli and we can't have ham on the premises. I'm sorry, we can't serve you. And I go home and write up a complaint of 178 ways this hurt my feelings. No, I don't want, do I want to go to a Muslim marketing firm, PR firm, and make them, if I'm a distiller of Kentucky bourbon, and I want Muslims, to a teetotaling religion, to draw up the ad campaign for Kentucky bourbon? Do I really want to do that? Do I want to insist, even if I say, if someone says, well, but you, Doug, you believe that it's lawful to eat ham and it's lawful to eat bacon. You believe that the Jews are wrong on that point. You believe they're mistaken on that point. Because the Messiah came, we can eat bacon. Yes, I believe they're mistaken on that point, but I don't believe in using a cudgel on a fellow citizen to convince him to my way of thinking. We're not supposed to use coercion that way. All right? I'm not a teetotaler, and the Muslims are. I don't believe in coercion over issues like that. I don't want to go into his business and say, well, you must take this account. You must advertise something that you believe to be sinful. Or a Christian who believes that gambling is a scourge. Well, we want you to take our account. We want you to get involved. Why can't we simply say people can opt out of offering service to someone if their conscience is violated? We want to live in a pluralistic society. We don't want to spend all our time making people do things the way we insist that they do things. Well, that's democracy, someone might say. Yeah, well, democracy is 3 coyotes and a sheep deciding what to have for lunch. Okay? We don't want that kind of democratic process. We don't want rule of the people. We don't want rule of the mob. We don't want rule of the rich few. We don't want an oligarchy. What do we want? We want the rule of law. We want justice. We want fixed standards that are not changed as a result of the last election. All right? And I would argue that we can't have that without Jesus. We can't have that without a return to the one who gives us these rights. So, there's a difference between a sin and a crime. So when it comes to evangelical pastors, colleges, schools, it was Aaron mentioned in the previous session that the Solicitor General, in the case that's before the U.S. Supreme Court now, that if same-sex marriage is imposed on all 50 states, then what ramifications, what implications will that have for 501c3 schools, churches? Well, there will be direct implications. And they're not going to be able to all of a sudden arbitrarily stop. There are such things as slippery slopes in the world. And you can't get 3/4 of the way down the slippery slope at a good rate of speed and decide, I think we're going to stop now. By what principle? Right? How are you going to stop now? How are you going to say that a polygamous marriage is not a marriage? What principle are you going to appeal to? You can't trash tradition on Monday and expect to find it still there operating on Thursday. You can't do that. So what's going to happen is this. We are going to find ourselves in this mess where all of a sudden we're going to have to think fast. Our advantage is, I believe, that a lot of Christians have been busy tending to their own knitting. That is our virtue. That is our vice, if you know what I mean. We've not been paying attention to what's been going on in the legislatures and in the administrative agencies, and there are people who have no families, they have no kids to raise, they have nothing to do but be angry all day and file complaints against businesses, and they claim to be the forces of tolerance and love and acceptance. Many years ago, there was a proposition in Idaho, I forget the number of it, but it was a same-sex proposition, and it was one of the attempts to put a firewall into the laws of the state of Idaho, and there was an uproar. and I was invited by the League of Women Voters to participate on a panel, and we got there about half an hour early, and the room was maybe a little smaller than this, but it was jam-packed, full of homosexual activists, all of whom had signs. There were more homosexuals there than were in all of Idaho. And I'm pretty sure they were all flown in from New York City. And they were all sitting there ready to be agitators, and they all had signs. And the evening was raucous. It was a raucous evening, such that I wrote a note out to send over to the moderator to call the cops. It was one of those things. Never had to shove it over there, but it was looking promising. It looked promising several times. But there was a classic moment at the end of the evening. And I wish I had a cell phone, or it was before cell phones. But at the end of the evening, there was a guy sitting over on this side of the audience. He'd been heckling me through the course of the evening. One time I'd said, well, suppose I'm a manager at Arby's, and he erupts. Arby's? Why Arby's, Doug? And I said, look, we disagree on a lot of things, but it seems to me that I should be able to say Arby's without you. I hadn't even made my point. He just goes up. Well, at the end of the evening, he stands up, and this is where I wish I had a phone, or that I was fast with a phone. He stood up, and he had a sign, and it said, no hate here. And he hoiked up the sign, no hate here, and with the other hand, he flipped me off. Well, that says it. That says it about perfectly. And this is because tolerance is not, they claim to be tolerant, but they're anything but. All right? They claim to be sensitive, but they're anything but. They claim to be concerned about people being hurt, and they'll fall all over themselves to analyze 178 imaginary hurts, and are totally blind to genuine threat to a livelihood, a genuine threat to real people in real time, and they just ignore that. That's not tolerance at all. And the reason they've gotten all gummed up on this is because they failed to distinguish, as many Christians have also failed to distinguish, the difference between a sin and a crime. Not everything that's a sin should be a crime. Now, I believe that it's not sinful to decline to make a wedding cake for a homosexual. But even on your principles, there are classical liberals still out there. I think there are probably about 8 still out there who say, the client should be able to decline that business, right? Even if you assume that they are backward, or that, that 300 years from now, everybody's going to be making everybody wedding cakes and nobody's going to care. Even if you believe that, as a consistent liberal, you ought to say, it really ought not to be against the law. We ought not to make the rabbi make you a ham sandwich. We ought not to make the teetotaling Muslim advertise your Kentucky bourbon. We ought not to make the evangelicals celebrate something they cannot in good conscience celebrate. We ought to recognize that that's a sin, not a crime. But you can only have the distinction between sins and crimes if you've got a sovereign God. As Francis Schaeffer used to say, if there is no authority above the state, if there is no God above the state becomes God. If there is no court of appeals past the state, then the state is the final supreme say. All right? God is the one who can make a distinction between sins and crimes, and God is the one who can tell us, look, these are the things that I want you to punish. These are the things that I will deal with at the last day. Let me give you an example. Here's a sin that ought not to be a crime. Lust is a sin. Should it be a crime? Do you want lust police? Good grief, who would you recruit? Do you really want covetousness police? Covetousness is one of the 10 commandments, the 10th commandment. Do you really want covetous cops? That looks like a Land's End catalog. Those are, can someone sin? Can someone sin with covetousness and lust? Obviously, yes. And those are the things that with which the only competent authority, the only one able to deal with such things is God Almighty. The one who can search the thoughts and intents of the heart. He's the only one competent to deal with that. God has said that the civil magistrate is competent to deal with things like murder. And even there, we've got to have strict laws of evidence laid down for us. 2 and 3 witnesses, and you can't accept this kind of evidence, and you have to throw out that kind, that sort of thing. But a crime is objective, all right? It's something, and we have sanction from the Word of God to say, okay, something like murder ought to be against the law. Something like negligent homicide, if you get driving drunk, something like that ought to be against the law. Rape ought to be against the law. These are things where we can deal with people's behaviors, and we can evaluate whether or not this person actually did it. And we have sanction in the Bible to say that this is a crime. This ought to be a crime. So even if our bigotry against homosexuals were not biblical, I believe it is fully biblical, but even if it were not, to outlaw it is to attempt to outlaw thoughts and intents of the heart with which the magistrate is utterly incompetent to deal. The magistrate has no competence in that area. So consequently, if I believe that a certain false religion is passing by for swearing things, doesn't want to do things that I think are perfectly okay to do, what do I want to do? I want to love them. I want to love that gentleman. I want to leave him alone. I want to find someone else to make me my ham sandwich. And if push comes to shove, I might make my own ham sandwich. So, to cover this, just to review, sum up, and land, we are not in this because we're refusing to deal with homosexuals. We're not in this because we're opting out or bailing out of the same economy together with them. That's not what's going on. In doing this, we're not trying to resurrect the legally imposed bigotries of Jim Crow. We're trying to oppose another resurrection of similar bigotries. Just as in the old days, conscientious Christians fought the state trying to impose sin by a law. Psalms talks about that. Certain men who they're condemned by the word of God because they frame mischief, it says, with the law. They frame mischief with the law. Well, that's what they were doing there with Jim Crow laws. They were framing mischief with the law, and that's what they're doing now. They're framing mischief with the law. So we're not carrying any water for Jim Crow. We're fighting those who, under the cover of lies and deceit, are trying to resurrect Jim Crow themselves. We are taking the stand that we're taking because we must not allow our brothers and sisters who are blessed by God with an artistic touch and who are an artist's eye and who are therefore in the glorifying professions to be dragooned into glorifying things that none of us in good conscience could ever glorify. And even if we were wrong about this, we're not, but even if we were wrong about this, in a free country, we ought to be allowed to be silly in this way. All right? But it's not silly. There are deeper forces at work. The last thing, a word of encouragement. Some people think that these are dark times. I think they're certainly tumultuous times. But it reminds me more, I don't think that we're on our last legs at all. I think this reminds me of the end of the book of Esther. You remember in the book of Esther, Haman talked the king into framing mischief with the law, to having a law where all the Jews would be attacked on a particular day. And then Esther intervenes. Haman is hanged. He's executed. The king can't take back the decree, but then he gives a decree that says the Jews can defend themselves. And it's like everything's going bad for the Jews. It's going to go really, really, really bad. They're all going to die. And then, no wait. J.R.R. Tolkien called this a eucatastrophe. So we get to a certain point, it looks like we're all going to die. No wait, they're all dying. All right. No wait, it's all going to turn. I believe that we're in that position. The evangelical church in North America is a sleeping giant. Really sleeping giant. conked out giant. but a giant nonetheless. If we get to the point where the secularists overreach, and I believe that is precisely what they have done. They've overreached, they've wanted too much too quick, they're demanding it now. Self-control is not their strong suit. That's not what they're good at. Because of that, I believe they're running a grave risk of waking up that sleeping giant, and all that's necessary is for us all to stand up all at one time and say, no thanks, and rebuild liberty without permission. We don't ask for this. We're saying no. And that's what should have happened with Roe v. Wade, 1973. When they said it's mandated that you start dismembering babies in each of your states, 48 governors, there were a handful of states that had pro-choice legislation, but the rest of the governors should have said no. And that would have taken care of it. Right? We need to grow a backbone, grow a spine, and start saying no. And we need to start saying no all together. So it's not the scattered no, and the Klein's going first, right? It's everybody all together saying no all together.